At 7:20 a.m. on December 14th, 1943, Lieutenant Mike Tex Thompson pushed his P-47 Thunderbolt into a shallow climb above the French coast. The winter sky over the channel was the colour of gunmetal, layered with low cloud and streaks of contrails from the B-17s he'd been escorting toward Bremen. For 40 minutes, everything had gone according to plan. The bombers were on course. The formation was tight. The Thunderbolts prowled above and around them like heavy-armed shepherds. Then the needle on his temperature gauge twitched. At first it was just a small jump, the kind a pilot could blame on turbulence or a momentary hiccup in the cooling system. But the needle didn't settle. It kept climbing, one mark, then another, edging past the limit line painted in red. A sour smell filled the cockpit, the thick metallic stench of burning oil. Thompson glanced at the cowl seams in front of him. Wisps of smoke curled along the edges and vanished into the slipstream. The R2800 engine in the nose began to vibrate, not the familiar hum of a powerful motor working hard, but a deeper, harsher shake that rattled the rudder pedals under his boots and blurred the propeller into a silver disc. He reached down, checked his mixture, his supercharger, his cowl flaps. Everything sat exactly where it should. None of it mattered. The needle continued to rise. Thompson broke formation. He didn't ask permission. There was no time. He thumbed the radio switch long enough to bark a quick red 3 dropping out, engine trouble, and then rolled the Thunderbolt away from the bombers, trading altitude for airspeed. The horizon tilted. The cockpit filled with the roar of wind and engine and the faint crackle of distant radio traffic. He knew what came next. Every pilot in the 56th Fighter Group knew. When a P-47 overheated at full power, it didn't wind down politely. It came apart. The oil would boil, the cylinders would seize, and if the pilot was unlucky, the entire engine would tear free of the mounts and rip the nose off the airplane. 3 days earlier, they'd watched it happen. Another Thunderbolt one flown by a kid they'd called Kansas had started smoking during climb-out over the channel. He'd rolled over, nose down, trying to get back to England. The last anyone saw of him was a streak of fire disappearing into low cloud. The rescue launches found only floating wreckage and a smear of oil on the waves. Kansas never came home. Now Thompson watched his own temperature gauge creep past the red line into territory where numbers didn't matter anymore. He had less than 60 seconds, maybe less than 30. He slid the canopy back, unfastened the top of his harness in case he needed to bail out, and scanned the steel-grey water below for some patch where a parachute and a life raft might survive. What he didn't know, what no one had told him during the briefing that morning, was that his odds of survival had just doubled. Not because of anything in the cockpit, not because of any order from above, but because of a $3 piece of scrap metal installed illegally by a mechanic who was supposed to follow the book, not rip pages out of it. That mechanic's name was Jack Malloy. 2 days earlier, on the ground in Suffolk before Thompson's engine ever thought about overheating, Technical Sergeant Jack Red Malloy had stood in a drafty maintenance hangar staring at a line of Thunderbolts and wondering which one would kill a pilot next. The 56th Fighter Group S base sat on a cold, wind-swept patch of English farmland about 90 miles northeast of London. In December, the wind came in off the North Sea like a physical thing, sharp, salty, and relentless. It pushed frost into every crack in the concrete. It sliced through wool uniforms. It froze spilled oil into black glass under the landing gear. Every morning ground crews scraped ice off metal skin with gloved hands and the edges of wooden crate lids. They packed snow into sandbags. They lit small fires under engine cowlings to warm them before startup. And every day, despite all that effort, at least one P-47 came back with its temperature needle climbing into the danger zone. Malloy had been working on airplanes since 1937. He started on fabric-covered trainers back in Ohio, moved to single-engine fighters at Selfridge Field, and had followed the P-47 almost from the moment it left the drawing board. He'd watched it evolve from a stubby prototype into a 10-ton monster capable of hauling 8 50-caliber guns, bombs, and rockets halfway across Europe. He understood engines in the way some men understood music. He could hear the difference between a rich mixture and a lean misfire from 50 yards away. He could sense a fuel pump starting to fail by the way the cockpit gauges flickered during taxi. And right now, he was angry. In the last 6 weeks, 11 Thunderbolts in the 56th had reported severe thermal spikes. 3 engines had cooked themselves beyond repair. 2 pilots were dead. 1 was missing in action. Every failed engine told the same story. Turbo duct temperatures soaring, oil turning to foam, internal airflow that should have swept hot air out of the cowling, instead swirling uselessly around the back of the cylinders. Once overheating began, pilots had less than a minute before catastrophic failure, sometimes less than half that. Malloy walked slowly around P-47 number 42-51521, Thompson S aircraft still parked in the hangar from an earlier emergency landing. Steam rose in faint ghostly wisps from the seams of the cowling. Blistered paint discolored the metal near the exhaust manifolds. The smell of burnt oil and scorched paint mixed with the colder smell of wet concrete and winter air. He pressed a hand against the metal behind the engine. Even through his glove, he could feel residual heat burning through. The aircraft had been shut down for more than an hour. In this kind of weather, the metal should have been cold as ice. It wasn't tea. Heat had pooled somewhere it shouldn't tea. He'd seen this pattern before. The pilots made jokes about it. They said the Thunderbolt ran hotter than a stolen stove. They said it wanted to kill its own pilots before the Germans got a chance. They laughed in the mess hall because the alternative was sitting there in silence, thinking about the man they'd just lost. Engineers in the United States blamed the pilots. They said the men in the cockpit were abusing the engine, climbing too steeply, revving too hard, running mixture settings that would have made the instructor pilot faint. Command blamed poor operating procedures. Fighters were supposed to climb at specific angles, use water injection only as directed, and treat war emergency power as a last resort. Malloy blamed the design. He kept a notebook in his breast pocket, pages worn thin and stained with oil. In it, he recorded everything: outside air temperature, climb angles, power settings, manifold pressure readings, the exact minute on each mission when a pilot reported the first sign of overheating. He talked with pilots after they landed and wrote down their descriptions. He quizzed other mechanics in the 62nd and 63rd Squadrons about their own overheating cases. A pattern emerged. Engines failed most often under 3 conditions: steep, sustained climbs, high-speed dives that ended in a climb, and long, hard turns at combat power. In each case, the turbocharger spooled up, boosting manifold pressure and cylinder temperature. That part was normal, but instead of hot air being drawn smoothly through the cowling and expelled into the slipstream, it seemed to pool somewhere in the rear of the engine bay, like smoke trapped in a room with no open window. The R2800 was a masterpiece of engineering, 18 cylinders, 2 rows of 9, supercharged and intercooled, capable of pushing a fighter past 400 miles per hour. Heat was inevitable. But this wasn't just heat. This was a structural flaw. One night, long after most of the ground crews had headed back to their barracks, Malloy stayed in the hangar with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. Wind rattled the loose corrugated panels overhead. A single work light hung over Thompson's Thunderbolt, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Malloy spread the P-47 maintenance manual across an overturned crate and flipped to the section on cooling airflow. Diagrams showed the path air was supposed to take from the front of the cowling, around the cylinders, past the oil cooler, through the turbo ducts, and out through a series of vents and flaps in the rear. On paper, it looked fine. In the real world, something didn't add up. He traced the airflow path with the tip of his pencil again and again, his finger tapping on the rear of the engine bay where the lines on the diagram grew vague. The schematics showed arrows curling gracefully around the back of the cylinders and out through exit flaps, but they didn't account for small manufacturing. Differences, field repairs, dented panels, or the way hot air behaved when the airplane was pulling 5 Gs in a high-speed dive. He walked back to Thompson P-47 and climbed a step ladder to run his hand along the upper cowling seam. He tapped lightly here and there, listening to the echo, feeling for any subtle change in temperature or vibration. There it was. Just behind the second row of cylinders, above the turbo ducting, he found a spot where the metal felt noticeably warmer than the rest. Not just warm, hot, even 2 hours after shutdown. He slid his hand farther back. The temperature dropped. Forward, toward the propeller, it cooled again. That one patch stayed hot. A dead pocket. All the cooling air screaming through the front of the cowling under combat conditions was swirling into that space, shedding its heat and going nowhere. Malloy could not change the basic structure of the P-47. He couldn't redesign ducting or move bulkheads. What he could do was give that trapped heat somewhere to escape. He walked to the far end of the hangar where wreckage from previous accidents lay stacked on wooden pallets, bent propeller blades, twisted landing gear, crumpled cowling panels with jagged edges. From the side of one ruined fuselage, someone had cut away a rectangular panel during salvage. It lay forgotten near a stack of cracked exhaust manifolds. The scrap had a shallow dent and a crease where some long-ago impact had buckled it. To anyone else it was worthless. To Malloy it looked like possibility. He clamped the panel to his workbench and sketched a simple shape with a Carpenter S pencil, a narrow rectangle, maybe 8 inches long and 3 inches wide, with a small curved lip at one end. No fancy geometry. Just enough surface area to open against internal pressure and enough curve to catch the airflow outside. Using a hacksaw, he cut along the lines and smoothed the edges with a file until the metal shone dull silver under the shop light. From another shelf he scavenged 2 small hinges and the spring assembly from a damaged cowl flap. The entire pile of parts scrap, panel, hinges, spring, and a handful of bolts was worth maybe $3. He carried the pieces back to Thompson S Aircraft and held the panel against the hotspot behind the engine. The fit wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. This wasn't a factory drawing. It was a battlefield patch. He marked 4 drill points. Each turn of the hand crank drill echoed through the empty hangar. Shavings of aluminum fell to the floor like silver snow. He bolted the hinges in place, attached the spring, and tested the flap manually. It pivoted outward easily and snapped back shut when released. In theory, the mechanism was simple. When pressure inside the cowling rose when trapped hot air built up behind the cylinders, the flap would push outward, bleeding that pressure into the airstream. When pressure normalized, the spring would pull it closed again, preventing unnecessary drag. In theory. Malloy tightened the last nut and stepped back. The little flap looked almost comically small on the big fighter, a fingernail on the back of a fist. But sometimes that was all it took. A small vent in the right place could change the flow of air through the entire system. It was also completely unauthorized. The Army Air Forces maintained strict rules about modifications. Anything beyond routine repairs had to go through the engineering office. Anything that changed the airflow or structural integrity of the aircraft had to be approved by people with rank and drafting tables. Unauthorized changes could lead to disciplinary action, and if anything went wrong in flight, the blame would fall on the mechanic who had dared to tinker. Malloy knew all of that. He also knew 2 pilots were dead and another was missing because their engines had cooked themselves while the paperwork crawled across desks and ocean away. He left the flap installed. Just before dawn the next morning, pilots of the 56th rolled out of their barracks toward the briefing hut, shoulders hunched against the wind, collars turned up, hands wrapped around tin mugs of coffee that cooled faster than they could drink it. Thompson walked with them, jittery from lack of sleep and too much thinking. He'd replayed Kansas's final minutes in his head a dozen times. The smoke, the radio call cut off mid-sentence, the awful silence afterward, the idea that his own engine might decide to follow the same path every time he pushed the throttle forward, sat like a weight in his chest. After the briefing target Bremen, altitude, formation assignments, expected flak corridors, probable fighter opposition, the pilots dispersed toward their aircraft. Thompson walked across the frost-rimmed dispersal area to his P-47 and stopped short. Something looked different. Beneath the nose, just behind the engine, he saw a small panel with fresh drill marks and bolts still shiny from the toolbox. A hinge, a spring, a flap he had never seen before. Malloy stood nearby, hands buried in the pockets of his greasy jacket, watching his reaction. "What's that?" Thompson asked. "Pressure relief," Malloy said. "You've got a heat pocket back there. This'll give it a way out." Thompson crouched to look more closely. "Authorized?" "Not yet," Malloy admitted. The smart move would have been to order it removed. But Thompson trusted his mechanic. Pilots joked that their lives depended on two things: their own judgment and the man who turned the wrenches. Malloy had kept his aircraft running through months of brutal flying. If he said the P-47 needed a vent, Thompson believed him. "Will it hold?" he asked. Malloy shrugged. Only one way to find out. Before they could say more, Captain Collins, the group engineering officer, strode across the dispersal area. He had the perpetual tired look of a man who spent his life arguing with both pilots and headquarters. His gaze swept the aircraft, and his eyes locked instantly on the new flap. "What the hell is that?" he demanded. Malloy explained. "Heat pocket, overheating incidents, pressure vent, scrap parts." Collins cut him off. "Unauthorized modification. Remove it." Thompson started to protest. Collins shut him down with a look. Regulations were regulations. No mechanic could change the structure of an aircraft on his own authority. Malloy stood at attention, jaw tight. "Yes, sir." Collins walked away, heading for the next aircraft in line. The moment he was out of earshot, Thompson looked at Malloy. "You taking it off?" Malloy stared at the little flap for a long second. "Not if I can help it." The mission horn sounded. Engines began to cough and roar to life around them. There was no time for further argument. 3 hours later, over the French coast, as Thompson watched his temperature gauge spike, that little unauthorized flap made its decision. Internal pressure inside the cowling built like steam in a kettle. Hot air, trapped behind the second row of cylinders, surged against the metal skin. The flap flexed, strained against its spring, and snapped outward. For the first time since the Thunderbolt had arrived in England, the heat in that pocket had somewhere to go. In the cockpit, Thompson saw the needle twitch and then fall. Not much. Maybe a needle S-width at first, but enough to break the fatal trend. He eased his climb angle, cracked his cowl flaps a little wider, and watched in disbelief as the temperature stopped climbing. It hovered just above the red line, then slowly sagged back into the realm of merely dangerous. He kept the engine running. He kept the prop on. He kept flying. Instead of blowing up over the channel like Kansas, he nursed the Thunderbolt back toward England, listening to every noise, feeling every vibration, waiting for the slightest sign of failure. The little flap stayed open in the slipstream, bleeding off just enough heat to keep the engine alive. When he limped back onto the runway at the Suffolk base and rolled to a stop, Malloy was already running toward him. Thompson climbed down from the cockpit with shaking hands. "It pegged the needle," he said, and then it came back. It actually came back. Whatever you did back there, Malloy was already crouching by the flap, touching the metal carefully. It was hot, but not scorching. The paint around it was a little discoloured. The spring had held. The hinges were intact. "Looks like it works," he said quietly. Word spread fast. Other pilots who had watched Thompson peel out of formation and assumed they'd lost another man started hearing a different story. The engine had overheated, yes, but it had cooled again. He'd made it home. Something their Thunderbolts had never done once overheating reached that point. Within hours, pilots were lining up to see the little flap. Mechanics from other squadrons came over to inspect it, prodding gently, peering along the cowling to see exactly where Malloy had placed it. Collins arrived in the middle of that gathering, jaw locked, expression unreadable. He listened silently as Thompson described what had happened. He crouched beside Malloy, looked at the hinge, the bolts, the way the panel sat flush when closed. He pressed his palm to the metal and felt the heat. "How many of these have you installed?" Collins asked. "Just this one, sir," Malloy answered. Collins stared at the flap for a long moment, then straightened. "Install them on every ship in the group," he said. For now, this conversation never happened. Malloy nodded once. That afternoon, he and a small army of mechanics installed 12 more flaps. By midnight, every operational P-47 in the 56th carried a small, unauthorized vent in the rear of the engine bay. The real test came 10 days later. On December 24, 1943, the 56th Fighter Group received orders for a long-range escort mission deeper into Germany than they had flown in weeks. Intelligence officers warned of heavy resistance. Multiple Luftwaffe fighter wings had repositioned to intercept American bombers trying to take advantage of a brief break in the winter weather. The mission profile read like a list of everything that had ever overheated a Thunderbolt: extended climb to altitude, prolonged cruising at high power above the bombers, then aggressive combat maneuvering against enemy fighters. Before the flap, engineering officers would have expected at least a couple of engines to cook themselves on a mission like this. They braced for emergency landings, aborted sorties, and pilots forced to bail out in enemy territory. Snow fell in thick, wet flakes across the airfield as ground crews moved between aircraft in the grey pre-dawn light. Engines turned over one by one, coughing clouds of vapour into the cold air before settling into deep, steady roars. Mechanics checked the new flaps, making sure ice hadn't frozen them shut. Malloy walked from plane to plane, tapping each hinge, working each spring with his gloved fingers until he was satisfied. At 7:10 a.m. the pilots arrived from the briefing hut. Thompson gave Malloy a quick nod as he climbed into his cockpit. There wasn't much to say. Either the flaps would work under full combat load or they wouldn't tee. The Thunderbolts taxied out through slush and snow, lined up on the runway, and launched into the pale winter sky. Malloy watched them disappear into cloud and felt that familiar hollow in his stomach. For ground crews, the worst part of any mission was the waiting. Hours later, as bombers and escorts crossed into Germany, radio traffic began to fill the airwaves. Flak over Hanover, fighters climbing in from the east, more contacts from the north. The Thunderbolts of the 56th Dove climbed and turned to meet them. Thompson's combat report from that day painted the picture in crisp, stark lines. BF 109s coming up from below, FW 190s diving from above, the sky filled with spinning contrails and exploding flak bursts. He pushed his engine to war emergency power 3 times during the engagement. Each time, he watched the temperature gauge with his heart in his throat. The needle rose, but it behaved. It crept into the caution zone, hovered, and then eased back as the little flap behind the engine snapped open and vented the worst of the heat. Other pilots experienced the same thing. They climbed steeply to intercept diving 190s, rolled over into high G turns to protect the bombers, and stayed in the fight longer than they would have dared a month earlier. Engines ran hot, but they held. 2 Thunderbolts took hits that day, one through the wing, one through the oil system, but neither failed from overheating. Every aircraft that launched returned to base. When the first Thunderbolt broke through low cloud over Suffolk and dropped its landing gear, Malloy felt his shoulders relax for the first time all day. One by one, the rest of the formation followed, some with flak scars, some trailing a wisp of smoke, all under power. Thompson taxied in, cut his engine, and slid the canopy back. "Ran her hot enough to fry eggs on the cowling," he shouted down to Malloy, and she never went past the line. Engineering officers compiled the data that evening. 29 aircraft flown, 0 overheating incidents. It was the best mechanical performance the group had seen since arriving in England. 2 days later, a field modification bulletin went out to other P-47 units in the theatre. It included a simple diagram, location of vent, hinge type, spring tension, drill pattern. No name appeared on the drawing. Somewhere in the small print, under Origin, a clerk had typed 56th Fighter Group Field Expedient. Requests began arriving from other bases. Could they copy the modification? Did it affect structural integrity? What were the results under sustained combat conditions? The answers came back quickly. Yes, negligible, and excellent. Within weeks, mechanics from other groups were cutting their own vents, some using scrap panels like Malloy, others fabricating cleaner versions from fresh sheet aluminum. Some units experimented with different sizes and spring strengths. A few added secondary vents. The airflow problem that had haunted Thunderbolt units for months began to vanish. By spring of 1944, overheating incidents in P-47 units had dropped so sharply that engineering officers who had once dreaded the daily maintenance reports now read them with something approaching satisfaction. Republic Aviation, reading the same reports, quietly incorporated a refined vent system into later production models. Official histories of the Thunderbolt would later praise its ruggedness, its ability to absorb damage, its .850 caliber guns, its success as a ground attack aircraft. Few would mention the months when engines cooked themselves above the channel, or the small flap of scrap metal that changed that story. For Malloy, life didn't fundamentally change. He still spent his days crawling under wings, tightening bolts that no one else thought needed tightening, listening to engines run at different throttle settings, teaching younger mechanics the sound of a healthy supercharger versus one about to eat itself. If you'd asked him about the flap, he would have shrugged. Just a vent, he might have said. Air's got to go somewhere, better out than in. But the pilots knew. They knew when they pushed their engines into steep climbs and the temperature gauges behaved. They knew when they came back from missions that would have broken their aircraft before. They knew when their friends stopped disappearing from the sky without a shot being fired. The effect of that confidence was hard to measure on a chart, but easy to see in the way pilots flew. They used the Thunderbolt the way it was meant to be used, aggressively, decisively, without constant fear that the engine would betray them at the worst possible moment. That, in turn, kept bombers alive, put more bombs on target, and shortened the war just a little. Years later, historians would tally up sortie counts, engine failure rates, and mission abort statistics. They would note a sharp downward kink in the overheating curve in early 1944. They would credit improved field maintenance or refinements in cooling design. They wouldn't know the exact night a mechanic in a cold hangar decided that he was tired of writing letters to the families of dead pilots and picked up a hacksaw instead. That's the thing about war. The stories that make the headlines are about dogfights and big offensives and famous names. But the war itself is held together by people whose names never appear in dispatches. Men who spend their nights under the wings of airplanes, inventing $3 fixes that turn death sentences into close calls. On that morning, above the French coast, when Thompson-S gauge spiked and then steadied and the propeller kept turning, he didn't see the flap open. He didn't hear the change in airflow. All he knew was that the engine he had expected to betray him chose instead to hold the line. He brought the Thunderbolt home. That is what $3 of scrap metal and one mechanic S stubborn refusal to accept that S just how it is accomplished. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Subscribe if you haven't already. We rescuing forgotten stories from hangars, airfields, ships and battlefields every single day. Stories about the men who fought, the machines they trusted, and the tiny decisions that changed everything. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or somewhere else around the world? You are not just a viewer, you're a part of keeping these memories alive. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure the quiet ingenuity of men like Jack Malloy doesn't disappear into silence.